North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and began their invasion of South Korea. The Korean War has broken out. President Syngman Rhee urgently conveyed the fact of the North Korean attack to President Truman of United States of America. President Truman immediately convened the UN Security Council following the attack by North Korea. Within a few hours, representatives from around the world gathered urgently to discuss the situation. This meeting became a pivotal moment in deciding the international community's response to the Korean War.
첫째, 대한민국 사병들은 전투 경험이 전전 없다. 25일 날은 일요일 거다. 무기는 이북보다 훨씬 약하다.
It was a perfect ambush. North Korea launched simultaneous attacks starting from the western Ongjin Peninsula to the eastern ends of Kaesong, Pachon, Hongchin, and Gangneung. The South Korean forces were unable to stop the North Korean army advancing with tanks at the forefront at all. The South Korean forces retreated continuously without being able to establish a proper defense. Kaesong and Pachon were occupied by North Korean troops in an instant. The South Korean forces' anti-tank guns and rocket launchers were useless. Why did the South Korean forces have not a single tank? Even before the war, the South Korean forces showed false claims and a will to attack North Korea. There were concerns that supporting them with weapons might provoke the Soviet Union. So they left behind only the minimum amount of firearms. In fact, the United States was not very interested in the Korean peninsula. At 1 a.m. on the 28th, North Korean troops began to enter Seoul over the Miri Pass. Seoul citizens, deceived by the false broadcasts claiming that the South Korean military was winning and advancing, hurried to evacuate only then. At 2:28 a.m., the Han River Bridge was blown up. Many citizens crossing the bridge were sacrificed. At 5 a.m. on the 28th, 3 days after the outbreak of war, North Korean troops will occupy Seoul. North Korea's war plan was to achieve a swift resolution. The main forces would quickly occupy Seoul. The mobile units that captured Chpincheon by the 25th would rapidly advance to Suwon. They would encircle the major units of the retreating South Korean military. To annihilate their forces, the goal was to end the war by August and unify the Korean peninsula. The main forces of North Korea occupied Seoul according to their war plan. However, the mobile units failed to capture Chuncheon as planned. They crossed the Soyang River 3 days later than planned due to the desperate defense of the 6th Division of the South Korean military, which was preparing for actual combat. The plan to move to Suwon and encircle the South Korean forces fell through.
Gentlemen, we face a serious situation. We hope we face it in the cause of peace. The only reason for the action was taken on advice of all the brains that I could muster.
President Truman quickly made the decision for the United States to participate in the Korean War. General MacArthur, the commander in the Far East, was appointed as the commander. He sent the 24th Infantry Division, known as the Smith Unit, stationed in Japan, to Korea. On July 1st, the Smith Unit arrived in Korea and first encountered North Korean troops in Osan. The Smith Unit was composed mainly of untrained recruits. They underestimated the North Korean troops. The result was a complete defeat. With the weapons they possessed, they could not stop the North's T-34 tanks. The Smith unit managed to hold off the North Korean forces for only a few hours before suffering significant losses and retreating. The North Korean forces, having defeated the US military, were boosted in morale. On July 7th, the United Nations Security Council established the United Nations Forces. The UN appointed MacArthur as the commander of the United Nations Forces. President Syngman redelegated the operational authority of the Korean Armed Forces to the United Nations Forces. The United Nations Forces needed to slow down the advance of the North Korean troops. Weapons, supplies, and personnel to assist South Korea were too far away. The United States prioritized the deployment of its Pacific Fleet. The US 8th Army, stationed in Japan, also needed to be mobilized. Time was needed until the supporting troops arrived. The US 24th Infantry Division aimed to delay the advance of the North Korean troops in Daejeon. The inexperienced US troops were surrounded during the Battle of Daejeon and suffered significant losses before being defeated. Brigadier General Dean went missing and ultimately became a prisoner of war of the North Korean forces. The US military reassessed the North Korean troops. They were well-trained soldiers. Reservists with combat experience from the continental US were recalled, and equipment was loaded onto ships. On August 1st, the UN forces established the final defensive line along the Nakdong River. The battle for the Nakdong River defensive line began. To the east of Daegu, the South Korean army defended, while the US troops held the west. They fought using all available resources and firepower. A war of attrition unfolded, characterized by battles of strength against strength. One of the fiercest battles was the Battle of Dabyudong. If Dabyudong were to fall, there would be no place to defend up to Daegu. Over the course of 18 days, there were 16 fierce battles. The North Korean forces even mobilized personnel from the rear units to send them into battle. The South Korean army also gathered personnel ranging from young student soldiers to those aged 40. If we breach this place, we can unify the Korean peninsula. If this place gets breached, everything will be over. With this determination, everything was burned at the Nakdong River.
그 후방에서 부식이 올라왔는데 사과하고 뭐 사이다 하고 이런 게 올라왔는데 먹을 사람이 없어. 아군들은 일개 중대가 한 22명 남았을 거야 아마. 그래밖에 없어요.
All our forces were poured in, and Kim Il-sung's plan to occupy Busan by August 15th has failed. Now, it is time for the counterattack.